What's up, everybody? Welcome back to class for some World War II notes. This is kind of a little supplemental lecture that's not going to be too lengthy, but it would really kind of tack on to the notes that we already did on the Allied Air War. So that last chunk of notes and the stuff on Memphis Belle, I would add this material there. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen are a squadron of all black fighter pilots that fight and win a ton of honors during World War II. I haven't covered them yet or even really shown any movie clips or anything yet because I guess I look at it like the main impact that like air forces had on World War II was at this point through 1943-44 through strategic bombing, through these bomber squadrons going and trying to hit German factories and cities and limit their production and their ability to wage the war. So most of our airmen, most of the guys that were in the Air Force essentially at the time are on bomber crews, the vast majority. But fighter pilots, the guys that are flying the P-51 Mustangs, some of the coolest stories come out of their experiences in the movies that kind of focus on them. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen are a special squadron. They're kind of separate and maybe in some ways you'd even say elite, but also just a normal fighter pilot squadron that primarily was used to escort bombers, to protect bomber squadrons. And they saw most action through the Italian campaign, which I'm also posting some notes on that today or in the near future. Now, think about it. What was racism like back 80 years ago or 100 years ago? We've talked about that quite a bit, and I've hit a few lectures. Remember, racism of 1930 or 1940, 1943, the year we're talking about now, is a whole different animal from modern day racism. Like, there is no debate that racism was absolutely systemic back at that time because you can go read the policies and see where groups like specifically black men are discriminated against and held to a different standard specifically and only because the color of their skin. For example, we had talked about like the US military was still segregated during World War II. Now, black guys are allowed to see combat in this war, but they have to be in their separate isolated units. Now, looking at like cutting edge technology of the day, which is the Air Forces, these bombers and the P 51 Mustangs. That's a new plane that has just come out in the last year or two. It's our best plane in the European theater of the war. This is like new technology. And it would be logical for any military to have some of their best and brightest flying this state of the art aircraft, right? So, with the conventional wisdom of back in that era, that kind of ruled out black guys from being pilots because there was this overall attitude that blacks are mentally inferior. Of course, there is a kind of at this point in history, a growing minority, some rumblings that are pushing back against that and saying, there are no facts or stats or data to back that up. That's just people's opinion. And those are old racist opinions that are left over from, Civil War days that are still kind of permeating in our culture. So there are some advocates, specifically one very powerful advocate that like some of the black guys that wanted to fly these planes had was Eleanor Roosevelt, who we haven't talked much about yet, but the president's wife, the first lady. She was very much against, she was kind of the anti-racist of her day in some ways, and pushed for a lot of like progressive and social issues back in that era. Anyway, she is a great champion of the Tuskegee Airmen and advocates and talks to the president and says, I think some of these black guys in the Tuskegee squadron would make wonderful fighter pilots, and why don't we give them a chance and see what they can do? So anyway, eventually, there's a lot of backdoor wheeling and dealing going on. There's a lot of pushback, and it kind of goes back and forth. But it's decided that we're going to try a all black squadron of fighter pilots as bomber escorts and see how they do. These guys, the first pilots going in, remember, they're definitely being discriminated against. They're held to a different standard. They're well aware of this. You know what I mean? They're living through it and experiencing it. So why was there so many of them that were willing and they were essentially begging for the chance to go fight in the war and put their life on the line, for a country that really isn't even treating them that fairly? I think there's a couple answers for it. For one, A lot of these guys are true patriots, and I think they truly believe that they can be just as good a fighter pilot as anybody, regardless of skin color, and they feel like they have something to prove. Okay, so a lot of them are trying to break those glass ceilings, and they're trying to open new doors, not only for themselves but for people that look like them. And additionally, many, I think, just look at this as it's a cool opportunity. Lots of young guys, white guys, black guys, it doesn't matter your race, looked at like, hey, if I have to do a job in the war, being a fighter pilot seems like a pretty cool one, and it's kind of prestigious. And it's like, yeah, of course I want to go do that and fly this state of the art, equipment and be a hot shot, fly boy. So anyway, the Tuskegee Airmen, this is a big experiment, and people are watching to see how this will play out. There are many people that are hoping the Tuskegee Airmen, or the Tuskegee experiment, it was sometimes called, to see if black guys are capable of operating this kind of equipment. There were many people that were hoping they would fail. They also have a lot of people out there that are very much hoping they would succeed. At the end of like the kind of Italian campaign and the bombing and basically their tour of duty, I think it was a resounding. They were successful. They definitely broke down some barriers. They end up being one of the most decorated squadrons out of World War II, regardless of race or anything like that. And there was two squadrons of Red Tails, they were called. Now, how did they get that nickname? Well, from the plane I have there, every squadron kind of has their own moniker, or they'll have their own symbol or logo, and they'll do something kind of unique and different to uh, their planes. So this squadron of all black fighter pilots, the Tuskegee Airmen, they chose to have red tails painted on their planes. So you could clearly see they were the only planes up in the sky, the only fighters that had bright red tails, so you would notice them miles off. I guess they ended up developing a reputation for being great at sticking to their job and defending the bombers they were assigned to protect. Whereas a lot of other pilots would often want to break away and go tail after other enemy targets, and then sometimes leave their bombers defenseless because they're out kind of hunting for glory and shooting, tracking down other German targets. The Tuskegee Airmen were known for being very disciplined, sticking with their squadron and protecting their planes, which I think is a very commendable thing. So the Red Tails, or the Red-tailed Angels, are an all-black fighter pilot squadron from World War II. They had tremendous results, break down some barriers, and then this really whole episode or angle of the war is going to be a great transition that I will talk back about, or remind you of in quarter 4 when we start getting into the civil rights movement, because a lot of people's experiences during World War II help get the ball rolling for the civil rights movement that's going to begin roughly 10 years later. Okay. All right. So hopefully you enjoyed the notes on this. And if you want to see this in a movie, I might include a scene or two today. But there's a movie that just came out about 10 years ago called Red Tails. If you're interested in this, if you want to see more of the fighter pilot angle of the war, and specifically like the obstacles that the Tuskegee Airmen were overcoming, I'd highly recommend you check that movie out. I do think it's out on some different streaming apps, and yeah, it's a pretty good one. So I give it a thumbs up. All right, take care.